Yay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. We love trade. We are champions for trade, whether it's exporters, whether it's importers, whether it's foreign direct investment. Today, we're going to be talking more on the investment side, but it's still all trade. It's building prosperity across regions. It's creating connections that ultimately keep our world together. Can you imagine a world that was as crazy as ours today without international trade connections? It would be a disaster. And so we are doing God's work, whatever God you worship. Undoubtedly, the trade people in this room and around the world within the global tribe are keeping us together. And I'm really just so thankful to be just within earshot of so much of what's going on. And so, those of you here today are right in the midst of it because we're going to be talking about something really important: the foreign direct investment, trade and investment, not just done by the countries, but by folks who are working at states, provinces, cities, regions, however you want to define it, not at the country level, at other levels. It's such important work. And so we have two real great experts here talking about it. They'll be conversing. You'll have a chance to chime in, ask questions, provide your feedback on it as well. Troy DeFrank is one of those extraordinary leaders that is here, that is an expert in this area. His company, G3, is a member of Global Chamber. I think we met probably through some of the work that he's been doing in the Pacific Northwest and the British Columbia side, kind of that corner of the world, but he's expanded quite beyond that. And it's been in a variety of different and helping a variety of different organizations. So, Troy, thank you for the fantastic work that you do in connecting people up together in a variety of ways so that FDI happens, and really appreciate the fact that you'll be guiding this conversation today. And I think you've got Paul here today, so I'll let you take it from there and introduce Paul.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. Appreciate the platform and the stage from the Global Chamber. Always great to be involved, to be active, and get connected with a lot of the folks. I will introduce Paul here in a couple of slides. I'm going to kick things off. You set the stage nicely, Doug. I appreciate that. When we talk about international trade and FDI, foreign direct investment, I think there's a lot of different actors. It's fairly sort of complex arena, as we all know. And I'm going to be talking about, let's say, one aspect of it, but one that's increasingly important, and that is subnational actors in the international trade and investment space. I'm going to share my screen here, and the obligatory, can everyone see this?
Looking good.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. So, yeah, I thought Cesar and I were talking a few months ago and kind of talking a little bit about our work at G3. A lot of it centers around working with subnational actors and entities and organizations around trade promotion, investment attraction. And we thought maybe we could dig a little bit into that, and we could provide some of our perspective in terms of trends that we're seeing, why we think it's relatively important, and maybe how the landscape might be shifting a bit. This could be obvious to some folks, but in our experience, it's maybe a little bit more subtle, and so it's worth maybe teasing out a bit. And fortunate to have Paul Martela on the call as well, who's going to provide some perspective from both sides, from both the public sector side and some of the work he did, and then on the private sector site selection side as well. So appreciate that. So I'm going to kick this off to start by just kind of setting the stage. So in 2022, the U.S. government basically named Nina Hachigian as the first U.S. special representative for city and state diplomacy. And it was kind of a quiet, but I think pretty watershed sort of moment that really signaled, how important cities, states, subnational entities, at least in the US, but also globally, I think are becoming in the world of economic development, diplomacy, international trade. And so that's really spurred us, at least at G3, kind of thinking about a bit more about how this came to be and who these actors are and what are they doing. And so we did a little bit of research around this. I'll also start defining with the definition here, like what do we mean when we say subnational actors? I mean, we essentially, I mean, primarily cities. And when you think about cities, think about organizations that some of you might be familiar with, like Invest Hong Kong or London and Partners. States, provinces, maybe prefectures, you know, those sort of like defined um, political entities at the subnational level, like a British Columbia Trade and Investment, or Invest in Niedersachsen. And then there's some other ones that are maybe less sort of defined politically that are like regions. So I'm thinking like Midlands Engine in the UK, or even closer to home for me, the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, which actually spans international border. It goes from Vancouver, BC down to Portland, and they actually do some formal kind of trade and investment work. So these are the kind of entities that we're kind of referring to, we're talking to, or talking about when we talk about subnational actors. Um, and why we kind of think it's important is that they're really kind of growing in importance in shaping international economic relationships globally. And also they're kind of varied in how they engage foreign markets, these entities that I think is kind of worth digging into. So essentially the long-term trend here is I don't want to make it as clear cut as like we're sort of moving away from this to the other one. It's a little bit more complicated than that, obviously. But you know, you sort of have this traditional notion of commercial diplomacy at the national level, right? So this is your network of diplomats and commercial attaches that were embedded in embassies and consulates around the world, and they would do things like you know, market research and market assessments in foreign jurisdictions, due diligence on potential partners for companies, you know, in these markets, trade financing, trade agreements, bilateral agreements, and then high level political and business delegations, right? And I think what you're kind of moving towards is what I kind of like to think of as a subnational marketplace. So you've got a lot of like just a boom in these various subnational actors and entities over the last really 10 to 20 years, I would say. Um, and so it's a much richer, more active landscape of all these cities and states and regions. New York and California kind of pioneered it, I would say, in the early second half of the 20th century, by kind of going out and doing this on their own, as it were, and then kind of followed by places like Ontario and Bavaria and Germany. And then along the way, I think the regions that were really active and really kind of aggressive were sort of countries within countries. You know, think about places like Quebec or Catalonia. I think everyone kind of understand what I mean by countries within countries. Um, and so what are these? My zooming in is kind of strange here, sorry. And these organizations, again, kind of do similar things than as our traditional kind of commercial diplomats and national governments did, I think, but getting a lot more specialized and a lot more nuanced, obviously. But they still do things like trade promotion and export promotion. They do foreign direct investment, and they provide things like soft landing programs, right? So it could be physical space or professional services to help companies, you know, invest and expand into their region. They facilitate collaborative research between universities or R&D entities, tourism promotion, and then some slightly more traditional, right, sister city relationships, because I think an early kind of initiative or activity for a lot of these organizations. I guess maybe here I'm gonna I'll flip it to you, Paul, down in San Diego, to maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit your perspective. Obviously, you did some work in Europe for a couple of U.S. states, and would love to maybe to get you know, a little bit of color. If you could provide some color on your experience working for you know, one of these agencies or entities in a foreign market.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks. Right. So I did represent in Europe three American states, Pennsylvania, which, as I learned in talking to Troy last week, is our native state, and then New York and New Jersey. During the years that I was based in first London and then Brussels and then back in London, but my territory was the whole of Western Europe, there was really nothing analogous to what the US federal government has instituted, I'm guessing about 12 years ago, called Select USA. So all of the work involved with attracting foreign investment actually fell to states and cities. And it varies, but typically there are between 20 and 25 American states that are represented both in Europe and in Asia at any point in time. In Europe, it was called CASE, the Council of American States in Europe. And although we were obviously competitive with each other, we also saw the benefit of coming together and joining with, for example, embassies and consulates in different European countries to hold Invest in USA days. So, because we could obviously draw a bigger crowd than if I were to go there saying, I'm representing Pennsylvania, please come see me. So we also engaged in trade promotion, a little bit of tourism attraction, but the federal government actually, had, a very strong role, particularly in trade promotion. So we didn't get very active in that particular area. And so I think I was at the recent Select USA conference in Washington, D.C., as were a number of Global Chamber members. And it was interesting to me. I didn't count, but I'm guessing there were 25 or more American states and territories and municipalities represented in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Guam and the Navajo Nation. So absolutely, subnational organizations are getting ever more aggressive in their competition for foreign direct investment. I think that's all I have.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, Select USA is a good point. It's a great showcase of how diverse it is and that's more or less just in the US, right? But you go to some of these other big shows, even like a web summit or something like that, and there's whole pavilions just full of these subnational invest in wherever or jurisdiction trade and investment. It's really it's quite a diverse ecosystem globally.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about like when these actors or entities engage in foreign markets, the other thing we were kind of curious was to look at like how are they actually doing it. And it's not too dissimilar from when I would say a private company looks at a foreign market and wants to expand into that market. There's obviously a variety of different methods or approaches that they can take. But so we kind of looked at some of the common approaches or models that these cities and states were expanding into foreign jurisdictions. And it kind of runs the gamut from what we like to call like an honorary consul or a sort of an ambassador model, where you have someone typically like an expat or more of a ceremonial role. It's very sort of low risk and expensive for the jurisdiction, all the way to a full service office, right? And there's a couple of different sort of steps in between there. There's hybrid models. We've seen hybrid models where jurisdictions, depending on the foreign market, they might do one approach or another. Consulting firms are often used. They are sometimes some of the big four consulting firms, and these entities will engage with these consulting firms for them to sort of provide lead generation services or market intelligence or run programming in foreign markets for them. Boutique consulting firms, not unlike our own G3, independent contractors, full-time employees. As you get towards that, obviously the complexity and the cost becomes a lot higher, but your ability to sort of develop deep networks, really sort of engage markets for the long term really increases. So we've seen a lot of these models. I've certainly been engaged either as some of these models or working with them. And of course, there's always the model where these jurisdictions just sort of go around and do traditional trade missions, or go to conferences, and they're sort of more one-off, much more opportunistic. They're not really committing to foreign markets. But these are kind of the standard models that we typically see. I'm not going to spend too much time on the benefits. In some ways, I think they're somewhat obvious, right? There's clearly economic growth benefits, increased, visibility and awareness for some of these jurisdictions by, being more internationally active and engaged in certain markets, showing up at events. It helps spur local innovation through, just general network building globally. Global Chamber is a great example of that, bringing people together, and watching interesting things sort of grow out of that. One thing I think that is really important with the growth of these subnational actors is that the services that they provide to private companies who might be looking outside the US can be really customized and tailored and really highly valuable, I think, for these for a lot of these companies. And so, Paul, I wanted to get your perspective on sort of that side of the equation of, as someone who did some site selection work and consulting for private companies, how did you, what kind of benefits you saw, or how did you engage with some of these, these subnational actors and cities and states when you were looking abroad?
Yeah, very interesting question, because with a few exceptions, and I'll get to those, when we would look or evaluate different international locations for companies, we wouldn't look at it on a national level. What we were interested in U.S. parlance would be the standard metropolitan statistical area, or what's more broadly known in Europe as the travel to work area. And that's where the analysis took place, because obviously within countries, particularly larger countries, there are huge differences from one location to another. And what really mattered were the sort of cost, quantitative variables associated with a given location, as well as the qualitative variables. And so most of our work was with the investment promotion agencies at the more local level. And there were a couple of situations. For example, Procter & Gamble was a repeat client of mine, and they were looking for an optimal location in the Americas for a shared services center. And one of the countries that where they had substantial operations and wanted to consider as a place to consolidate was Venezuela. And this was in, I think, the year 2000. And that was at the time when Hugo Chavez was running Venezuela. So, I mean, that's a situation where at the national level, I don't care how attractive Caracas was, it was simply not going to be considered seriously because of the threats, the political instability, limitation on repatriation of capital or profits, threat of nationalization and expropriation, requirements by governments to have a majority stake, and so on. So in large part, our interactions were with, as I said, the local economic development agencies. However, when we got to the point of negotiating incentives on behalf of our clients, to the extent that they wanted to negotiate incentives, then many of the programs are at the national level. And so we would engage with federal officials in the country concerned to negotiate incentives. I just remember one situation where it was for Western Union, was a client, and they were considering Chile as a location to put a call center for South America and Central America. And we met with actually the finance ministers, so the Janet Yellen equivalent down there. And I sat in there in the office along with my client, and I said, okay, well, we'd like to talk about incentives now. And they said, we're not offering you any incentives. And I said, no, sir, you don't understand. I have my client right here, and we're considering to put a big investment in your country. He said, well, we have a 10% corporate net income tax rate, and if that's not a good enough incentive for you, then you might as well go somewhere else. And we did. And anyway, Western Union ended up in Costa Rica. So I don't know, are there any more points that you'd like me to cover on this,
No, that's
Troy?
great, Paul. I appreciate
Okay.
that. And we can always have, if folks want to dig into some of those fun stories, I'm sure we can after the presentation. But your
Right.
comments around sort of like the subnational or the city versus the sort of national level, I think leads us into kind of maybe one of the challenges of sort of this, let's call it a devolution, right? Or at least the rise of kind of these subnational actors. Obviously there's resource limitations. Some of these organizations are quite small, and depending on tax base or the global economics, there might be a lot of fluctuations in resources, which can affect their strategy and their models of engagement internationally. There's political shifts, right? At the local level. I mean, maybe all of us can kind of think of when a mayor or governor has changed over, and it has. Well, Paul, I think you did some work in Florida, right? I don't know if that was political motivated, but they went through some changes there. And that can, a lot of these organizations have been built over a long time, can get sort of restructured or shut down overnight based on political changes at the local level. So number three is the one that I was kind of alluding to on your comments, which is coordinating with the national government, or maybe lack thereof. Sometimes the local priorities or strategies, or kind of what their vision is from an economic development perspective may not gel with the sort of the national regime. And so sometimes you might have a bit of a conflicting story there in terms of like the national strategy and the local. You might have overlapping activities, maybe a redundancy of activities and messaging and outreach, and potential inefficiencies, I would say, from that perspective. The fourth one is really interesting, which is and something we deal with at G3 a lot with our clients, which is increased competition. And my business partners in Silicon Valley can tell you that anytime they go into a room, an event or a conference, there's usually a handful of these organizations that are a lot of times saying the same thing to the same group of companies on a consistent basis. And so it really forces a lot of these entities to, I think hard about how they differentiate themselves. What are they offering that's unique, to sort of separate themselves from their competition, because it is extremely competitive in this world. Why this matters, I won't spend too much on this. I think it's really interesting. We spend a lot of time, I think, at least the media does, and maybe folks in this line of work, thinking about deglobalization, this idea of deglobalization and an increase in isolationism. Sorry. And I think what, in some ways, this rise of subnational actors really has acted as a bit of a counterbalance to that. I think you are seeing still a lot of really good connections being made in relationships at that subnational level happening. That's bringing a lot of these regions closer together, where at the same time, you are seeing some major players in the world kind of maybe be less engaged globally, and a weakening of some of the long existing kind of relationships and alliances that have happened at the national level, the geopolitical level. So I think it is important that this is happening, and it is a bit of a counterbalance to some of that. This is the sales pitch. This is more about us, though. If you're interested, our firm, g3globalpartners.com, some of the folks that we've worked with, and that, as you can see, does span, national level to subnational to a little bit of private sector as well. We like to think about these kinds of things and these trends. And if you're interested in how we think about some of these things, we try to post it on our Substack blog called States of Trade. So feel free to check it out. But that's all I have. Paul, anything else on your end before we maybe open up for Q&A or comments or anything like that?
Yes, I did want to come back to the point that you were making about being in at a venue where all of the subnational representatives are all claiming to have the best workforce, the best infrastructure, the best business environment, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and frankly, that's one of the reasons why companies are apt to hire consultants, is to sort of sift through that sort of marketing pitch versus, what the data actually says. But one of the things is that to some extent, some of these local groups have drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and they really think that they're are all things to all companies, and every place around the world wants the investment that is high paying, has no kind of adverse environmental impact, results in a lot of secondary sort of spin-off jobs, and so in addition to all the corporate consulting I've done, I've also done consulting for investment promotion agencies in 10 different countries. And one of the most difficult parts of that exercise is getting to the point where you have to tell the agency that they're not going to be successful if they're going to be pursuing a particular sector. And the way, but it's a message that has to be delivered, because otherwise they're going to be wasting a lot of time and energy and resources on chasing facility types or industry verticals which simply aren't a good fit for the location attributes of their particular area. So a lot of that is done through like a competitive benchmarking to, for example, to have like a straw man kind of investment, and then do modeling of that location against what they consider to be their 3 or 4 top competitors, and show them how they stack up against those competitors. And sometimes they stack up favorably, and a lot of times they don't. And then they have to be told, you're better off focusing your attention elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great points, Paul. One that I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, it's sort of like this I mean, so much training essentially needs, right, for a lot of these organizations to sort of go through all of those processes of benchmarking and value prop, really deep dive into sort of value proposition, and then strategy and execution and all that I think is really important. And some do it much better than others, frankly, from our experience. But yeah, I guess at this point I'll open it up to any comments or questions from any of the folks that are on the call now, or Doug, happy to flip it to you too. But yeah, you feel free to just chime in if you'd like. Pankaj?
Hey, Troy and Paul, this is Pankaj. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I just put my contacts there. We are totally new, around 2+ years, working VC and fund manager. Recently joined Semicon West in San Francisco. So yes, what you cover, I didn't have any like a background, anything. I'm a typical IT guy, but we are doing all this, and all my investors they are very good. Like they teach me all this feasibility studies, blah, blah, all these and all. And we are also facing, I'm in US 30 years, US citizen. So we are following US guidelines and rule and everything. But when we are working with the other countries, Latin America, Europe, even my own country like India and Asian countries, life is really tough. So Paul and Troy, please share your contact. We don't want to waste other people's time. So we can talk, and we have few projects and we have tons of investors. We are directly working with them. So we
Hey,
can share.
Shankar, do you have a question?
Sounds like he might have a need. So I think Paul and I are happy to share our contact info, and I'm sure Doug and your network in the Global Chamber have plenty of folks that Pankaj should connect with, so that makes that process maybe slightly less painful.
I guess the question that arises out of the topic are people with money and funding, how do they play into the ecosystem that you're working with? Do you work with private investors kind of within this ecosystem, or are they a valuable resource sometimes through this process?
Well, I'd let Paul answer on his end. From our perspective, yeah, we work with quite a few, either on the venture capital side or private equity side, we call them capital investors, who might be looking at, opportunities abroad. And, we certainly want to advise them on jurisdictions, again, that might have incentives or accommodating regimes for them to deploy their capital, or, might have sectors or ecosystems that would be, really good places for them to scout opportunities. So that's certainly part of our work. Again, we tend to do that on behalf of our, foreign economic development clients, right? So we're out, trying to talk to those people to understand what their interests and needs are, and then in some ways point them in the right direction abroad. But yeah, we certainly work with them. Paul, I don't know about your side.
I would say that in general, I'm not working that often with VC or PE firms. Certainly working with the individual companies in their portfolio, but not, at the overall corporate level. Although, to some extent, I think it might make sense, especially if the PE firm or the venture capital firm is heavily focused in one highly specific industry vertical.
What about big entities like, take example of TSMC coming in from Taiwan to the US, where really the person who did that deal was the mayor of Phoenix, Mayor Gallego. However, the state claimed response, we did this, and so what our own personal experiences, the states tend to be more political, and then the people at the lower levels tend to be more action oriented and hands-on and just more let's do this. Is that probably an overgeneralization, but how does that play into it when you've got a big player like that, and then the wake that it brings in, right? In that particular case, you've got GPEC, you've got all the different cities around Phoenix, you've still got the state involved at some different level. Like suddenly there's a feeding frenzy on what the opportunities are. I'm sure you've seen that in other locations.
Yeah, I think your generalization is fairly accurate from my perspective, Doug. I think obviously the bigger the project, right, the more capital intensive, the more labor intensive, I feel like the higher the involvement goes, right? And then certainly when you're thinking about industries like semiconductors or, energy, or increasingly AI, I feel like you start to bring in sort of more, national, regulatory bodies, those types of things. I think the other thing with those types of companies, at least in my experience with working with companies like, an Amazon or a Microsoft here locally, is that they've got their whole divisions of people within the company that can do either site selection on their own, or they've got in-house lawyers, usually a lot of them, that are doing this. It complicates things in a way where it brings in a lot more interests, not necessarily competing interests, but a lot more cooks into the kitchen, as it were. Paul, anything you want to add there from your experience?
Well, I would say that it may be, an unfair characterization to say that the people at the state level aren't, working very hard on it, particularly on a project of that scale. Naturally, all politicians love cutting ribbons, and governors are no exceptions. And so I have a lot of experience with seeing the worker bees actually do a deal, and then the next day there are headlines that the governor had a phone call with the company and, made, sealed the deal, made things happen, wrapped it up. And, that's just not the case. But anyway,
But by the way, I did not mean to infer that the states at any level of the states aren't working hard. It was just more of a point that it tends to be more political. And actually your example is a perfect example of that, right? There are many hardworking people at every entity. And in the case you cite, where people at the state level, there's some amazing people at every level. Even up to the governor in many states, right? I mean, those are extraordinary people. However, people are going to claim credit. I don't think, I think what I'm hearing is it doesn't really kind of play into it. And you guys are just kind of navigating all that. It probably does, however, create opportunity for the subnational, the topic of this Globinar is it's creating the politics at a higher level create opportunities at the lower level for people to do even more work and to collaborate and to find opportunities.
Right.
Well,
So
don't let me
Troy,
say something not true, but it seems like that might be the case.
No, that's fair. And Troy alluded earlier to work I did for Florida. So I was the SVP of business development for what was known as Enterprise Florida, which was the first public-private economic development partnership, I think formed in about the mid-90s or something like that, and considered a model for success. It has since folded back into state government as a Department of Commerce, but two instances there when I was there. So a Chinese company wanted to make an investment in the panhandle of Florida, but the governor refused. And so they located just across the border in Mobile, and that was purely a political, in my judgment, purely a political decision. And then more recently, so when Governor DeSantis got into a tussle with Disney, and Disney was going to invest in a new operation that would have created 3,000 additional jobs in Orlando, and because of what Governor DeSantis had said about Disney said, okay, we're not doing that. So that really aggravated people at the local level. So in both cases, the people in the Panhandle desperately wanted that very large Chinese investment, and Orlando clearly wanted that 3,000 job investment. But at the state level, politics got in the way.
I see that Roberto has patiently had his virtual hand up for a while. So Roberto, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I'm curious about, well, two things. We're talking about a huge scale here, and I would like to know if this flow of capital from one country to another happen on a much smaller level, and I'm not in the IT arena, but for example, I'm involved in the real estate business. I'm an architect. And I'm curious just to know how this goes, how this flows, because I think there's a lot to be done. For example, here in Mexico, the yields are great, and there's a lot of business to be done, but I don't know how you see things from your perspective, Troy.
Yeah, so from my perspective, so your first question around scale, I would actually say that in a lot of my work, and I'll note that a lot of my past experiences is US, Canada, right? So I feel like obviously there's a proximity factor there. There's an ease of doing business cross-border factor there. On average, most of the projects that I worked on were fairly small, and they were in the IT space. So they were, startups that needed to put or wanted to hire 5 to 10 engineers in Canada, right? They might even want to put an office, in a physical office. So they just wanted to sort of set up an entity and hire for immigration reasons or whatever it may be. So a lot of it depends, at least again from where I sit and where my firm sits. We represent our government or economic development clients. And so they typically have some sort of strategy and priority list of sectors and priority list of projects that they want to bring in. And then we proactively in the market go out and try to find those. And so sometimes they might be smaller projects. If it's a smaller market or smaller client who doesn't have a very well-established startup or tech and innovation ecosystem, they may be perfectly fine with us going out and trying to find small startup opportunities to bring into their market, right? I would say from my I don't do a ton on like real estate side because again, our clients typically, that's not to say they're not happening. It's just they're not terribly visible for us because we're not proactively going out trying to find them unless it's some sort of manufacturing or like life science play or something like that, right? Paul, I don't know if on your side, if you've got other perspective to add there.
Honestly, I don't think that I do now.
Yeah. I don't know, anybody else want to chime in there? Eduardo?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to make myself available, no question or anything. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I have talked to Paul previously. We met, and what I do is I help companies locate options in Mexico, mainly contract manufacturing and a little bit of site selection. So I just wanted to make myself available if one of your companies is looking for either a solution or expansion, be happy to help.
Yeah, appreciate that, Eduardo. Certainly, nearshoring is a thing we hear about often, and I assume that you're actively involved on the nearshoring front. And we just talked about semiconductors. That's maybe an interesting opportunity there in that sector as well. So yeah, nice to connect, Eduardo.
Yeah, I've been doing nearshoring for more than 30 years. So finally it's something that everybody's talking about, but we've been doing it for a while. Yeah.
And to be fair, he's being very humble. He knows everybody in the southwestern U.S. and in Mexico. He worked for ProMexico, which goes to the point that you made, I think both of you made, that ProMexico was also disbanded.
It was, yes.
In fact, as you know, right? And Eduardo was caught in the crossfire because he was only allowed to work for ProMexico if he disavowed his American citizenship, which he did, and then they got disbanded. He had to go through the hoop to get his American citizenship back, which was a celebration for all of us. But politics got in the way of that one. But he is brilliant in terms of his connections and his ability to connect people. So thank you, Eduardo. You're very humble too.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be a U.S. citizen again.
I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to make two comments and then a question. Full disclosure, I work with Troy. I am his partner in business, so this is a bit loaded. To the conversation around capital investment, my other partner, Megan, and I are based in San Francisco Bay Area, and it's a very significant part of our work because we view VCs and corporate VCs as force multipliers and horizon scanners for new technologies for our clients, which are basically international dev. So it's a massive part of our work, actually, not necessarily attracting capital investment and making one-off introductions so that they invest, but to someone else's comment, their portfolios are rich of fast-growing companies, and having those relationships are key to our work. The second comment is about the political nature of this work and who gets credit. And I think that's just the nature of this business. A lot of the times when we're developing a strategy and executing on it, we do feel like we do a lot of the groundwork, but we're happy to pass off the recognition to the organization that basically is our client. So it's like that's just a pill that we have to swallow in terms of the credit of the work being done. Troy, my question for you is, when you think about delivery for your clients, and you can take it from like ideation to lead generation all the way to attracting investment, what would you qualify as the most difficult part of the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think quote unquote, closing the deal is always the hardest part, right? I think if you've got, you can always, I think you can find lead generation, right? You can find lead generators and find tools and company lists and contacts easier than ever, right? And I think that's less and less a challenge. Getting their attention obviously is still a bit of a challenge. But if you've got the right message, and you've got something compelling and you have maybe some sort of unique incentive, I think you can usually get conversations started and get them progress, connect them to the right people. I think it's that, what are you doing to get them over the finish line and actually make an FID, or like an actual decision on an investment, is always the challenge. And these are long. And the other thing is, like, being patient, right? Like, these are long. A lot of these are really long sales cycles, right? These are long decision-making processes, for a lot of these companies, certainly as the larger that they get. So keeping everyone kind of on the same page throughout this process, which, and a lot of times is several years. I think we've all worked on projects and opportunities that have lasted multiple years. And so keeping people patient and on the same page is part of that challenge, I would say. Paul, anything you want to add there?
I just want to comment on one thing that Tate said about being willing to not take credit for making the deal and allowing your client to take credit. I think if you didn't do so, you would have your contract canceled pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think, and I think the other aspect of that is, I use the phrase a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Canada is a great example of, like, there's the Invest in Canada at the federal level, there's provincial representatives, there's municipal, there's even regional, where it's like multiple provinces together. And all of them may have some touch point on the deal, but if an opportunity comes and a company invests somewhere, everyone wants to be the one cutting that ribbon, right? And that is a real challenge sometimes. And so that's one of the challenges of this whole, the rise in subnational actors, is that you do have, in some ways, some of the national government agencies competing in some ways with the local subnational entities, not always working together, trying to claim credit. So that's the other, I would say, one of the other challenges here.
I'll jump in as well. I don't see any hands. And full disclosure as well, I'm a G3 partner. Troy, thanks for the presentation. Your slide, particularly on some of the challenges, I thought was quite honest, and something we experience a lot. When you have clients that are looking at investment attraction in North America, I think we've seen a lot of times the flyover states get a little bit ignored, and people want to put someone in either San Francisco or New York and call it a day and then build it up from there. And Paul, thanks for your comments too. I don't know if you saw, we were nodding our head to a lot of what you were saying on that slide. My question to both of you would be, what would you suggest to a region that's looking at the US? How would you approach it geographically? And do you have any examples of anyone that's done it successfully?
You want me to take the lead on that one, Paul?
Well, so if I understand your question, you're saying how do we guide companies who are looking at the US as a whole? Sorry,
no, maybe more like international regions.
Yeah, so maybe like in Business France or something, right? Like an agency like that. That's probably not a great example because they have people already here. But if they were new to the market, and they were trying to attract US investment, I think to Megan's earlier point of, like, the knee-jerk reaction is like, well, let's have a person in New York and let's have a person in San Francisco. I would say a lot of times that's not the right strategy necessarily. And so I assume that's your kind of question there, Megan. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. Sorry. And especially I'm saying in cities where there's like a lot of different EDOs that exist, you have to get your elbows out and sharpen them. So would you look at a strategy or a plan in the US for an international organization? How would you approach it?
I think that to a large extent, it would depend upon the strategy for what kinds of industry verticals they want, what kind of facility types they're seeking. That might help to inform where within the U.S. to put something. I do know that, and I've seen this with so many corporate clients over the years, and I think the same principle would apply here, is that the CEO of the investment promotion agency, let's say Invest in France, based in Paris, they want to locate the U.S. office in a place with a direct nonstop flight to Paris, preferably many per day. But they end up coming only once a year or so. And so they end up setting up in a place that may be inappropriate just because it has better flight connections for their 1 or 2 trips per year. And, the cost profile typically of areas that have those direct flight connections is considerably higher than other places. So I think it would have to do with maybe any geographic concentration in the specific industries that they're trying to attract, allowing that to drive where it is within the U.S. They locate. I can't say that being in places like New York and Chicago and San Francisco and LA and Dallas and Houston and Atlanta don't make sense, because there's a lot of corporate activity there and a lot of people passing through. So it's a pretty hard sell to say, no, you should go to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, instead. Not to pick on Cedar Rapids, but I think you know what I mean.
It's a lovely town. Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I think, I mean, even your, like the cities you threw out there, Paul, I think are, I think a lot of those, some of the clients that or potential clients we've talked to, they're not even thinking of those, right? I think they're thinking of, we want to attract tech investment. We're going to go to the Bay Area, right? Well, it's like, well, what within tech, if it's robotics, maybe you should be in, Pittsburgh, right? I mean,
Pittsburgh,
not that you want to put an office there, but you want to be somewhere close where you can access that and be much more visible, I think. So
Right.
yeah, just doing that kind of market assessment and landscape analysis and really doing some due diligence. And being specific, I think, Megan, like, again, I probably made this comment already, but like a lot of our clients, they've got 10 different priority sectors, right? And it basically is everything under the sun. I think, drilling into what do you actually do well, or what do you want to do well, what do you want to bring into your ecosystem, really helps, I think, refine where you should be, what you should be saying, who you should be saying it to, that kind of thing. I think a lot of thought needs to go into that before you make those investments into a market.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Unless there's anything else, Doug, maybe we're good to go.
Any other questions?
Paul, thanks for joining me on this. I appreciate it. I know
Oh.
I pulled you in kind of last minute, but I think you added a lot of great perspective, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, really happy to do it.
Hey, Paul and Troy. Again, this is Pankaj. I am based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Send you a couple of emails. We will
Got
talk
'em.
online. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Where in Pennsylvania are you two guys from?
I'm originally from Harrisburg.
Okay.
And my first job actually was in Harrisburg, working for the Pennsylvania Department of Commerce, but I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. I
Okay.
went to school in Lancaster County, and Troy said, yeah, I used to go swimming at Franklin and Marshall College, so it's amazing. Small world.
Yeah,
Wow.
we're talking about all these crazy markets all over the world, and both of us are from central Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Lo and behold. By the way, I spent high school years a little bit upriver from the Susquehanna River. So, a river runs through it. I guess eventually, as Globies find ways to make connections in some way or
That's
another,
crazy.
the Susquehanna River or whatever it is.
Yep,
so
that's it.
Which probably most people don't even know, but it's a pretty big news in Harrisburg or in Endicott, New York, where I went to high school. Thank you, guys. That was really outstanding, really excellent information. I think this is one of those topics would love to have kind of maybe different spins of it, because it's such an important one for our community of exporters and investors. So thank you for taking the time. Are there any final, maybe 30 seconds each, any final comments to wrap up and things we should be thinking of? Paul, you want to go first and have Troy give the last word?
I guess the only thing I would say is that, the competition for investment is continuing to grow all the time. And who knows what's going to happen with the upcoming election. But with the Biden Build It in America emphasis over the past couple of years, I mean, that certainly has been an impetus behind lots of the foreign direct investment that has come into the U.S. of late. And when I at Select USA in Washington a few weeks ago, it was incredible how many foreign companies showed up and how many were interested in investing in the U.S. U.S. consistently ranks as the most preferred country in the world for foreign direct investment, and has done, I think, for 10 years in a row, according to an annual survey by A.T. Kearney. So, but it's and the nearshoring is obviously an extremely important development. I know that Mexico is starting to have some issues in Baja, especially with lack of water and instability of electricity supply. But anyway, Mexico will continue to benefit from the move back to North America from China.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Doug, to your point, you could take this a lot of different ways, because there's just so many. I mean, if you just look at the last 5 years, this industry has been disrupted by COVID. Well, like everything by COVID, it's been disrupted by technology, and sort of like how companies are looking at their global operations and remote work and all that kind of thing have big effects. Geopolitics has massive effects, as we talked about with semiconductors and nearshoring. And I'm not too familiar with it, but I hear there's a big election in the United States here shortly that will probably have some effects on, on how companies think about their global footprint and their global operations, right? And these things can have massive effects. And so there's a lot of variables, big ones that are worth thinking about. That they're going to keep this industry kind of always in flux.
Thank you guys for your time. Thanks everybody for attending. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thanks,
Thank
Doug.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.